Great. I want to welcome you to deploying 4G and 5G networks using CBRS shared spectrum. So glad that you're here this morning, this afternoon, from wherever you're joining us. So Award Solutions, we're a trusted training partner with so many companies, 255 companies plus in the cable space and the wireless space. And we train so many different companies around the world, really. We're the Mobile World Congress training partner, a CCA training partner, and we partner with CTIA as well. And we're a great place to work, so that's great. Brahim, welcome from Paris. That's fantastic. We focus on several different topics. LTE, we've trained over 100,000 people on that. 5G, 17.8 thousand people. Cloud computing, 25,000. In the last few years, we've done a lot of training on data and analytics like Python and Ansible and machine learning and several other things like that. All of our courses are role relevant, on demand or live, like this one. Hopefully they're KPI impacting. Our focus is to help improve the performance of individuals as well as networks. And 98% recommend our courses. So you're in good hands, and I hope that this course will meet and or exceed your expectations today. My name is Mark Harms. I love doing these sessions. I've been at Award for a while. I love technology, and I love making it simple. So I hope that today I can help simplify some things for you. I tend to focus on roles that are in business roles. So I get into some details, but not a ton of details. And you see more of my background there. I love soccer. I was born in Mexico, grew up in Honduras. And my Arsenal, my favorite English Premier League team, beat Liverpool yesterday. That was quite an accomplishment. And then with me, I have my colleague, Arvind, Dr. Karaya, and he's been at Award for over a decade, over 12 years, and he enjoys training RAN and core engineers, and he's on the chat as well. So if there's a question that comes in on the chat, you may see Arvind answer those questions on the chat. Arvind, thank you so much for being here with us today. I look forward to doing this with you. And I've asked Arvind to join us because he's going to be doing a CBRS Tech Primer, a 4-hour session later this month. More on that at the end here. Today, we're going to cover several topics, obviously all around CBRS. We're going to differentiate between the types of CBRS access, incumbent access, priority access, and general authorized access. We're going to talk about some example use cases of CBRS. There's so many. It's really multiplying in a massive way. We're also going to sketch out the architecture of CBRS so that you can understand what the key components are there and how you might want to use it. And then we'll describe the role of some key pieces, the CBSD, the spectrum access system, and the environmental sensing capability. And then we'll talk about some of the providers of those. And then at the end, I'm going to give you just a quick insight into the auction for Auction 105 that the FCC is holding later this month for CBRS PAL, Priority Access Licenses that are coming later this month. So if you look at that list of objectives, really quickly, I'd love to put put in the chat which objective is your primary objective here today in this 1 hour, and or maybe there's a term or a concept that you're really struggling with understanding, and you'd like to understand that term or concept better. So please jump in the chat and quickly tell me what is a key objective of yours for this session, and that'll help me tailor this session. Are you more interested in the use cases? Do you want to understand more about the spectrum access system? Are you curious more about the PAL licenses or the GAA licenses or some of those things? So I'd love to hear about that. I see from Dipankar, thank you, architecture and use cases, fantastic. Shalon agrees, CBRS use cases, awesome. Any others? Excellent, Michelle, thank you. I'd like to understand the use cases, complementary technologies, good. Andy, use cases, Prakash, guidelines of CBRS for enterprises, excellent. Denny, use cases, Gene, architecture and use cases, Prakash again, use cases, great. Architecture from John Thomas. GAA access, thank you, Ray. All right, Amir, use cases. Lance, Auction 105, who's bidding? I hope to have time to show you that at the end here, Lance. Anoop, overall CBS marketplace. All right, fantastic, thank you. So it looks like a lot on the use cases and architecture. So I will try to make sure that I focus my attention on that piece as we go through the session. Thank you for giving me that feedback. Again, along the way, comment in the chat window, ask your questions in the chat window, and let's have some fun over these next 52 minutes. So let's talk about some essentials. What is CBRS? Well, it stands for Citizens Broadband Radio Service, and it is a TDD, which means a time division duplex spectrum. In other words, it means that when I use the uplink and when I use the downlink is dictated by time, and it's the same block or the same spectrum that I'm using uplink and downlink, as opposed to FDD, full duplex division. Sorry, I couldn't remember. Full division duplex. And with full division duplex, I use one block uplink and one block downlink. And it's in that 3.5 gigahertz range. We'll get more specific there. We'll talk more about the three classes of users in CBRS. And it uses spectrum that was previously off limits. There's always a need for more spectrum. Think of it as the land you need to build a highway. And what we're trying to do in cellular networks is provide connectivity and capacity to our users. So we need more spectrum to be able to do that. And we need more spectrum to be able to provide wireless networks to enterprises or other companies. It's going to be managed by an independent system, open to brand new business models, and supports a wide range of services and traffic types. So the spectrum sharing model, I love this picture. It's a three-tier strategy that the FCC has defined. That should clue you into one important piece. CBRS is unique to the United States. It doesn't mean that other countries wouldn't take this same approach at some point, but it is unique. So this band is unique to the US at the moment in how it's being used in this three-tier strategy that the FCC, our governing body here for spectrum. Every country has one of these, and they will set things up like this if they want to. And so other countries may take that lead, other countries may not. But the first tier is this incumbent access. They are already using it, and we're going to protect their use, primarily the military, but also ground-based satellite and wireless ISPs. The second tier are these priority access licenses. So these folks pay money to get a license that they can use whenever they want. So the only people that have precedence over them or priority over them are the incumbents. And so these licenses, you lease them from the FCC, they're good for 10 years, and they are in 10 megahertz chunks. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then general authorized access, or GAA, is completely open, or you could argue that it's like unlicensed spectrum. In other words, I can use it. I don't have to pay the FCC for the right to use it. What's unique about this unlicensed spectrum is it's shared with everyone else. So therefore, as a GAA user, if a PAL is using that 10 megahertz block, or if an incumbent is using that 10 megahertz block, I cannot. However, we'll see here in a minute that this is designed so that ideally there's always some space for GAA users to use this. So those are the three tiers. I hope that makes sense. Again, if you want or have any questions or comments along the way, please dive in and provide those in the chat window. If you haven't opened up your chat window, please do so. And I'd love a question or two in the next couple of slides, so please do that. The band number, by the way, for CBRS is band 48. So if you're looking at phones and you want to see, does this phone support the CBRS band, you want to look for band number 48 support. And most phones for the last year almost have been launched that support the CBRS band. Specifically, the band starts at the 3550 megahertz range and ends at the 3700 megahertz range. You can see here where the incumbents have access to the full 150 megahertz of spectrum there. And fixed satellites have access to a good portion of it. Wireless ISPs have access to another good portion of it. Great, thank you, Prakash. How much does one have to pay to get a PAL spectrum? Well, the auctions, Arvin's already beat me to the answer. Thank you, Arvin. The auctions start July 23rd. We'll see. I imagine that it'll be a lot, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. Tier 2 access is where the PAL is. And notice that even though there's 100 megahertz of spectrum here, from 3550 to 3650, that only 7 of these will be used at one time for PAL. So that means that there will always be 3 of these available for that third tier or GAA. They could access at least 80 megahertz of spectrum. Again, it depends on where the incumbents start interfering with you or taking precedence over you. But they have access to all 150 megahertz. So it's a huge opportunity for people to use this spectrum, the GAA spectrum, for no cost as far as licenses go. So that's some detail around the CBRS spectrum itself. Good, I see something from Anton, ASA, LSA, does it apply to CBRS? Anton, help me out a little bit on ASA and LSA. I'm not familiar with those right off the bat, so please give me more detail on that, or maybe Arvind can answer that question. Thanks for the question, Anton. Please keep them coming, folks. The standard bodies that are involved in CBRS, the FCC, obviously, they're the ones that say, hey, it's band 48, as an example. And they define some of the basic rules for that spectrum allocation and licensing. They'll manage the PAL auction. And then Wind Forum is one that has defined some details on the architecture of CBRS, some interoperability requirements. And then the CBRS Alliance, now rebranded as OnGo, is developing specs for networking and coexistence with LTE and 5G. So you see a lot of different, these organizational bodies participating in this, which shows you there's significant momentum in this area. So that's great. Licensed shared access or authorized shared access. Good, Antoine, thank you. And maybe Arvind can help me with those, but basically, as he's saying, the PAL is a licensed licensed spectrum. And even though it is shared with incumbents, they take priority, if you will. No one else has to, a PAL licensee doesn't have to share it with anyone else. So whenever they need that a 10 megahertz block, they get a 10 megahertz block. Again, unless the incumbent is using it. So I hope that answers that question, Antoine. And the authorized shared access, I think that is talking about the GAA users. They do have to register in order to use it. And there is some authorization required there. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Great, thanks for the questions, Antoine. Thank you, Arvind, for tackling those in the chat window for me. Let's dive into some of the use cases. One is a fixed wireless network, relatively boring use case, but an important use case. And you can see that there's about, here in the US, 23 million people that lack access to 25 megabits per second on the downlink and 3 megabits per second on the uplink to their home. And the CBRS band, again, CBRS is not a wireless technology. It is a spectrum band, as we just defined. And that CBRS band could be used by a number of companies who want to provide fixed wireless access to homes. And the good news is, since that band is in the mid-band range, that allows for good propagation. If you're not aware of this, the low band has fantastic long propagation, but typically smaller channels. The mid-band has good propagation and slightly larger channels. And then for those that are talking about 5G, we're talking about millimeter wave bands that can be used in 5G. Those are much larger, but they have much less propagation. So this one, you could argue, is in the sweet spot for fixed wireless. We have good propagation and we have some decently wide channels. So I hope that helps as a good use case. Not exciting, not necessarily too sexy, but a lot of people are providing fixed wireless networks here in the US and around the world, and we'll see them begin to use CBRS as well. Another big one is a private network. One example of a private network might be a smart factory. So I can deploy my CBSDs. These are the CBRS devices. I'll talk more about this in just a minute. I can deploy them in my factory, those radios, and I can have all of my devices leverage that, whether it be outside, whether it be internal with small cells, either case could work. And then I would connect my radio access network there to a other network, the core network or the evolved packet core if it was an LTE network. If I'm deploying a private LTE network, this is what I would do. But I could also, maybe I don't want to create my own private EPC or my own private core. I could use someone who offers me a virtual EPC or core network, or I could also partner with an operator. So there's lots of options here in private networks. We're seeing more and more people deploy private networks. Ericsson and Nokia have provided and deployed a lot of private networks for smart factories, for smart ports. They are not using CBRS quite yet in many of those. They are beginning to use CBRS in some of those. Again, today they can start using the GAA blocks at the moment. And then in the future, if they want, they can bid for the PAL licenses and use those. Oops. Another opportunity here is a stadium where you would have the CBRS band. You would use that, again, regardless of the technology that you're using on that band. And you could share that radio access network with low, mid, high, and CBRS bands. I mentioned that that's band 48. And then you could connect all that through an IP network and allow different wireless operators to leverage that shared radio access network. There's something in the 3GPP specs called multi-operator core networks, or MOCN, and you can leverage that. So that operator A can use all of this infrastructure in the stadium, as well as operator B and as well as operator C. And that way you're creating an environment, that's why it's called a neutral host, where others can use that. It doesn't matter, it's not just one wireless operator that's in charge of that whole setup, but instead many. All right, any other questions in the chat? Please jump in the chat and give me some more questions. I love to have some back and forth here. Amarilla, I see one that you just popped in there, thank you. How do PAL license holders guarantee that their private networks will not be interfered by military grabbing the frequency? Thank you, Amarilla. I will answer that in a little bit, but fundamentally, we know where the military plans and is using this spectrum and where they aren't, and therefore there's an opportunity for, Amir, thank you, and there's an opportunity there, Amir, for you not to have that issue, and I'll show you that in just 1 second. Super. Thanks for the question, Amir. The answer's coming up soon. I've seen a lot of people calling it the innovation band. In fact, there was someone at Award Solutions when we were talking about this webinar. She mentioned, hey, I see all these things on innovation band, and the more I looked, the more I saw it. And it really is a unique opportunity for people to innovate here. So some of the use cases that we've talked about, the fixed wireless use case, I can use CBRS band for surveillance maybe. I can use it for these private factories, private ports, or smart factories, smart ports. I could also use it for metering, whether that be my water meter, my electric meter, or any kind of gas, any kind of metering. We talked about the neutral host situation in a stadium, where I may want to set that up so that all users from all wireless network operators can use the stadium and leverage the spectrum usage there. Also, we see a lot of cellular networks, like our tier 1 operators here in the US and others, leveraging this spectrum to offload their networks. So they could have a device that is band 48 capable and using LTE or using 5G. And when possible, they could use the CBRS GAA license to offload some traffic there. So that's one option. There's some exciting opportunities around AR, VR, especially with using 5G in the CBRS band or gaming. And then in the cable world, many cable operators like Comcast, Charter, and others, Altice, they have different MVNO agreements with operators in this country, and they have to pay them when their users use the network, and they pay them based on the amount of data that their users are using. And so one way to do this is to have a company, cable company, an MVNO type that's in an MVNO agreement, have them deploy an LTE network or a 5G network in some hotspots, and they can identify what those hotspots are based on their users' usage history, and they can deploy that and therefore not use their mobile network operator MVNO agreement in those areas, and instead use CBRS. if you think about this, since the opportunity is there with GAA, they can enter into that with little to no expense as far as the spectrum goes. Clearly, they have to deploy the radio access network and a core network. And then with PAL, they can guarantee better service. So this is another big important one, specifically for cable operators that have a mobile virtual network operator agreement with a wireless company. Great. I see Nabil ask a question, and it looks like Arvin has already answered that, so that's great. Nabil, just to be clear, 5G has those 3 usage scenarios, and I can deploy a 5G network in low, mid, or high band. And as Arvin has just pointed out, 5G is part of the CBRS specs, and it's part of the 3GPP spec, so I can deploy a 5G network using CBRS. All right, great. Please keep the questions coming. I love it, and thank you, Arvin, for being so good on jumping on those. Here's another quick thing. I could use CBRS in a retail environment. This story is amazing to me. I just have to show you this real quick. Give me a second to bring up this story. I don't know how many of you saw this, but one of the companies in this space is called RF Connect, and they built a private CBRS network for COVID healthcare tents back in May in New York. So, oh, sorry, this is in Memorial Health System Clinic in Springfield, Illinois. So just think about that. I can build a pop-up network, if you will, and allow people to gain access to this network very, very quickly. And that's one of the huge advantages that CBRS gives me. And they did that obviously using the generally authorized access licenses, or GAA, which are free to use. Lastly, this is the innovation band. So we're limited by our imagination. We don't always get to have that luxury, but at the moment we're limited by our imagination. So there's probably 30 other examples that we could talk about here in how to use CBRS. I am curious, as we look through these use cases, which one is most important to you? Is there a particular use case that you think is most important to you, or that you find most fascinating? I'd love to hear those from you. So please, in the chat window, give me a quick answer on which of these is most important to you, or which one do you find more fascinating. I see some questions from Manish. Do we get slides? Yes, we're recording this. You'll get slides. You'll get a link to this later. And then Amir, can CBRS be used for Wi-Fi? It can, Amir. So what we might see is in a retail space, maybe I want to use Wi-Fi so that my customers can continue to use Wi-Fi and offer that. But maybe for the stores who want to use a point of sale device and need a slightly more reliable or secure kind of network, maybe I connect them using a CBRS band, right? Using that CBRS band with a private LTE or a private 5G network. So absolutely, Amir, I see both of these being complementary. I think we will still have Wi-Fi because it makes sense and it's easy for people to do that. But then I may want a private LTE or a private 5G network in my mall so that all the retailers can use that for their point of sale or some other inventory mechanism or whatever. Maybe the security cameras can be on that instead of the Wi-Fi network if I don't want to wire them up. So I hope that answered your question, Amir. Thank you. I see some answers here on the favorite analogies or use cases, sorry. Dipankar likes stadiums. Ahmed also Wi-Fi 6 and 6E, very high speed, they can. And so when would I use Wi-Fi 6 or E as opposed to CBRS? Ahmed, I think there's 2 reasons. I would argue that a Wi-Fi network is easy to quickly deploy, but it's probably a little less manageable, while a private LTE or private 5G network, whether they use CBRS or some other band, gives me some more management opportunities, access control, and other things like that. Plus, with network slicing, with things like QoS, with things like the security protocols, you may argue that those are better in LTE or 5G over Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. Once again, though, I see these as complementary and less competitive. All right, do we need capable CBRS band phones? Absolutely, and they exist today. Most phones today support it. Nabil, great, smart factoring and metering. Nick, what's the reason behind band 48 being the most CBRS band used and not bands 42 and 43? Nick, band 42 and 43 go across that same spectrum and other 3GPP definitions used in other countries. But for the US, we've defined band 48 as the primary as the CBRS band, not as the primary, as the CBRS band. All right, and Andy says manufacturing is his favorite use case. Great, thank you guys. I love the interaction. Again, please keep it coming. And if I've missed the question, I hope that Arvind is answering that. Prakash, how about interference with other frequency? Yes, obviously it can happen, but at 3.5 in this range, we should only be interfering primarily with other CBRS users, and we're going to see how that's managed here in just a minute. So we shouldn't see a whole lot of interference from one frequency to a totally different band. It can happen depending on the scenario. You may need some guard band on both ends and some of those things, but for the most part, we shouldn't see that. Let's talk about the auction. The architecture. Our CBRS network, first of all, consists of the CBSDs. These are the CBRS devices. This is an unfortunate word here, that D stands for device, but what it really means is the radio. It does not mean the end device, whatever that end device might be. It means the radio. And so I am deploying CBRS, let's say, as a private LTE network for my smart factory. I would put up radios in my factory. Those radios are called CBSDs. And then all the devices that I'm using that connect to those radios are just end user devices or end machine devices like IoT devices. If I have a lot of CBSDs, I may want to connect them to a domain proxy just so that they don't all have to share one connection or all have to have their own connection, back to the SAS. But in the end, I need to connect them to the Spectrum access system. That is critical. And so once I've connected them to the Spectrum access system, that's the system that's going to decide and provide access to being able to use the CBRS spectrum and which block you're going to be assigned. And so if you want to use this, you have to ask for permission. After you ask for permission, you are granted that permission. Then you say, yeah, I'm ready to use it now. And then the SAS tells you, okay, here's the block and or blocks you are allowed to use at this moment. And the SAS leverages another system called the environmental sensing capability. And this node is always checking to see if the military or other incumbents are using that spectrum. And if they are, they inform the SAS so that the SAS can then control and manage the CBSDs and not allow them to use that spectrum while the military is using that spectrum. So there's definitely this full architecture that exists to allow that to occur. All right, Dipankar, you got a question in there. Looks like Arvind's already answered that. Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Keep the questions coming. Once again, thanks, Arvind, for answering them so effectively. All right, so CBSD, remember that's the radio. I've got the SAS, the Spectrum Access System. Think of it as the controller, the one that's giving the CBSDs permission. And one of the inputs it uses to decide whether you have permission to use that particular block of spectrum is the input from the environmental sensing capability that is sensing whether or not the Navy or an incumbent is using that spectrum and that particular block at the moment. Let's talk through these. The CBSD, as we talked about, is a station or a network of such stations. They can operate in the PAL or the GAA license usage. And for CBSDs, which have multiple nodes or networks of nodes, you may use that, coalescing of them with the domain proxy, as we showed there. But fundamentally, they have to be managed by that spectrum access system. All right, and the end user devices, as we mentioned, are not considered CBSDs. I hope that's helpful. Let's see, is the domain proxy proprietary? Good question, Denny. I'm not sure about that. Arvind might be able to help answer that one. And then Nabil, what are the other elements besides SAS that are additional to an LTE network or 5G network over regular bands? So Nabil, if I'm going to deploy an LTE network, obviously I need a radio access network. And that radio access network is composed of those radios. And those radios, if they are supporting that CBRS band, would also be considered CBSDs. and then they would have to be managed by the SAS. In addition to that, I would connect my radio access network to my core network. And like I said earlier, that might be my private core that I've developed, a virtual core that I get from another company, or I may partner with an operator to use their core or let them provide the entire system. So I hope that answers that question. Manish is talking about the types. Good, thank you, Manish. I should slip you a 20 under the table. Here's the two categories. Category A, CBSD, mainly used for indoor or outdoor use. And you see the power requirements of 30 dBm per 10 megahertz or 20 dBm per 10 megahertz. And then category B, more powerful, primarily used for outdoor. And as Manish is mentioning, there is some discussion about a category C. That discussion has begun, and it would be even more powerful. And that is still undergoing discussion. There's no final decision on that yet. Good. I see that that's what you're saying, Manish. Thank you. All right, CBSDs. All right, perfect. I think we're getting the answers here. So SAS is the only adult element. Only additional element. Yeah, Nabil, the operator can partner with a SAS provider, and I'll talk about who those SAS providers are. So if I'm going to deploy a private network, I don't have to create and deploy my own SAS. In fact, I can't. The SASs are approved by the FCC, and I'll share with you here in a minute who is using those. All right, I think we're getting a lot of these answered. If I'm missing one, Arvind will catch it in the chat or just ask it again. All right, Prakash, no, they're always checking. The CBSDs are always under control of the SAS, and the permissions granted are typically for a short amount of time. I'll talk about that in just 1 minute. So if I do have an end user device, it's easy for it to support CBRS. It just has to operate at band 48. And since band 48 is a TDD, time division duplex band, it has to be able to do that. That's it. Really simple for device manufacturers to add it. And like I said, for the last year, maybe longer, maybe a year and a half, most devices already support band 48. Here's the ESC. The ESC is always paying attention to what the Navy is doing. And as soon as it understands that the Navy is using that, the SAS, it communicates that information to the SAS, and then the SAS will make sure that the CBSDs in that area will not create interference with the Navy's usage. So in this case, it may tell this CBSD suspend operation because you're closer, and it may tell this CBSD reduce your power, because if you just reduce your power, you'll fizzle out before you get there and you won't create interference. So that's a key factor here. And the ESC providers, CommScope, Federated Wireless, and Google, those are have already been deployed. And I'll show you a map of the US in just a second as to where those are deployed, and making sure that the Navy, specifically on the coast, is not being interfered with. Okay, the SAS, ESC, and the domain proxy, let's just cover that again. Remember my CBRS radios, known as CBSDs, I can aggregate them in a domain proxy. And if I have an older radio that I don't want to upgrade its protocols to interface with the SAS, I can leverage the domain proxy to do that. But in the end, they all have to be controlled by the SAS. And then one of the inputs the SAS uses in deciding when and how to give it access to which block is the ESC, which is always monitoring the use of the spectrum by the incumbents. And that's how it protects them from interference. It can also protect PAL licensees from interference from GAA interference. And then all CBSDs have to register with the SAS. Fundamentally, if you want to use CBRS, your CBSD has to register with the SAS and has to be in control or under control by that SAS. Otherwise, you cannot use the CBRS band. All right, how can CBRS femtocell get GPS synchronization in indoor environment? Great question, Binaya. And that's a good question that Arvind can cover in the longer 4-hour tech primer. We won't have time for that today, but good point. We need some timing here when you're doing TDD and you're sharing a particular block. That's an important piece, and we can get into those details in the 4-hour tech primer that Award is offering later this month. SAS providers, there are 4 or 5 that are approved: Amdocs, CommScope, Federated, Google, and Sony. I think 4 of them got approved at once, and then 1 took a little bit longer. But basically, I can use any of these SAS providers. So they have their own business model, obviously. If I want to deploy a network and use CBRS, I have to register with that SAS. I have to choose who my SAS partner is going to be. There's a lot of pros and cons to these. We don't have time to get into all those details. And they have their own model as far as how many times I request to use the spectrum, how many CBSDs I'm registering, those kind of things. They would charge me. But these have been approved by the FCC, and they're the only ones that I can use to register with. Yeah, the SAS deployments are mostly cloud-based, Dipankar, thank you. And thank you, Nick. Precision timing protocol is used for indoor GPS or timing over packet. Awesome, thanks, Nick. All right, good. Keep the questions coming in there. I kind of went through this quickly a little bit earlier, but the CBSD requests permission to use the CBRS band. Then the SAS will say, sure, I'll give you that permission. And here's the block that you can use. Remember, these are 10 megahertz blocks. They're TDD. So if you take 150 megahertz, divide it by 10 megahertz, you have 15 of these blocks. And so the SAS is going to tell you which block to use. And even if you have a PAL license, this is unique. You're not bidding for a particular block. You're bidding for access to a block, not a specific block, but one of those 10 that are in that PAL license. And as I mentioned earlier, only 7 are going to be used for PALs. So more on that in a minute. But fundamentally, the SAS is in control here. It tells the CBSD, yes, you can use it. And here's the block I want you to use, or blocks. You can use more than one. And then it gives you that permission for a few seconds, maybe up to minutes. I think the max on the parameter is 240 seconds, but the parameter is in seconds. And you get to use it. It may suspend you, again, if there's interference that's being caused to a GAA or interference, obviously, to an incumbent. And the ESC is letting the SAS know that the Navy is using it. You may get suspended or terminated altogether. And then you would continue to have that exercise with the SAS so that you can use that spectrum. Arvind, thank you for sharing that the ESC and the SAS do not have to come from the same vendor. I could have my ESC from one vendor, the SAS from another, it doesn't matter. All right, fantastic. Let me keep us going here. We got about 20 more minutes. Yeah, Ahmed is asking about the bodies that define the interfaces. Ahmed, it depends on that area. So 3GPP is involved, Wind Forum is involved, and the CBRS Alliance, otherwise known as ONGO, is involved. All of them have specs around this, interoperability specs, specifics around the SAS to CBSD protocol, all those kind of things. It depends on the body and what area they're covering. And that's, so those are the 3 main bodies that you have to understand: what 3GPP has defined, what Wind Forum has defined, and what the CBRS Alliance has defined. Thanks, Ahmed, for the question. So real quickly, when you look at this geographically, we've talked about it kind of license-wise, but how about geographically? Well, when you look at it geographically, here's where the federal incumbents are, primarily the Navy, as we said, so it's primarily a coastal thing. And by the way, these dynamic protection areas are small little areas within here, and each one is being monitored by an ESC. And so CBSDs cannot cause interference in that when the Navy wants to use it. And so they will either be suspended or terminated for that time. So that's the federal incumbents. In addition, there's some fixed satellite service protection, or FSS, fixed satellite service. And again, CBRS cannot, we've got to be careful with its impact on interference there. So the SAS may help manage that. And then finally, there's some grandfathered wireless protection zones. And so these are protections based on aggregate interference. But despite all that, you can see that there's huge swaths of the country that are available for use by anyone, private networks, cellular networks, cable networks. It doesn't matter who wants to use the CBRS band. And these don't mean you can't use CBRS in these areas. They just mean that you don't have the priority. So if the tier 1 incumbent is using it, you can't. But if the tier 1 incumbent is not using it, you can. And when it comes to the Navy, I forget the numbers, but it's not like a ton of ships that are using this all the time. It's relatively sporadic. Arvin may have those numbers and can provide those in the chat. Great, thanks for providing some of the links there, Arvin, to the Wireless Innovation, the WIN Forum, to CBRS Alliance, and Ahmed as well to Wireless Innovation. Great, thank you guys. Keep the chat active, I love it. Let's talk about the auction in the last 15 minutes that we have. The auction is fascinating. I love auctions. You can connect with me on LinkedIn and see some of the articles I've written about auctions. But I want to be clear about this. This is the PAL auction, Priority Access License. And unlike other auctions where a licensee is assigned a specific block, they are bidding for a specific block. In this auction, you are not bidding for a specific block. You are bidding for one of these blocks generically. Which one will depend on the SAS when you're ready to begin using it. And it will be in this 100 megahertz range. So there's a total of 10 blocks. However, the FCC in each county is only auctioning off 7. So notice that there will always be 3 left over for GAA access. So even if all PAL licensees, those that win the upcoming auction for PAL in my county, even if all of them are using their PAL license 100% of the time, I still, as a GAA, maybe I'm deploying my own private network, maybe I'm doing something in my mall, maybe I'm doing something else, I still can use a block because there's at least 3 blocks available. Again, the SAS will manage that. I'm sharing with other GAA users. So there's a lot of interesting potential other usages here, right? But potential conflicts, but still there's that area that is done. Nabil, that's correct. The auction is done by counties this time around, and you can learn more about that auction, by the way. I'll show you that in just a minute. Sorry, Nabil, give me 1 second. I will highlight that the applicants that have been approved for this auction, it's fascinating. Cable companies, a company like Chevron, universities, A&M and Duke. By the way, Dallas Independent School District applied. Their application failed, but they are one of the companies that did apply. Electric companies, investment companies, smart factories, obviously members of the Competitive Carrier Association or CCA, obviously other tier 1 operators, the AT&Ts, Verizons, Dishes, T-Mobiles, Sprints, etc. Of the world. I'll just show you this real quick. We don't have time to go through the whole list, but here are the winners, sorry, not the winners, the applicants who won. I hope you can see that list, and you will see something like Alabama Power Company or the Amplex Electric Incorporated. Arbuckle Communications, I think, is a small thing in the Arbuckle Wilderness in Oklahoma. And then, of course, you see some biggies like AT&T, and then other ones like B Wireless, Big Ben Telecom. There are several interesting companies in here. I mentioned Chevron, by the way, Carolina West as a good CCA member. There's several different companies. City of Donaldsonville, isn't that fascinating? Some of these I don't know who they are. Here's Cox Communications. So will they be looking to deploy different things, different networks? That'll be fascinating. Several of them here. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see the list. It's pretty significant. Even Frontier, as they are coming out of bankruptcy, they are one of those highlighted. Charter, Comcast, even though you may not see those names, they're bidding under different names. Dish as well is bidding under a different name. So you have to do a little sleuthing to figure out who is really behind the name. I think it's a Wetterhorn is what Dish is, I think, or maybe that's Comcast. I get them confused. Here's Spectrum Holdings. So there you can clearly see Charter. And then Texas A&M, I mentioned them. I am in Texas, so that's an interesting one. And then we talked about universities. There's University of Virginia Foundation. And then companies, of course, like Verizon. And there's that Wetterhorn one, which I think is Comcast. It might be Dish. Actually, I think it's Comcast. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that. The other fascinating thing is that there's 270 something, I think, numbers of applicants. So that's one of the largest numbers I've ever seen in an FCC auction. So we'll see how this auction goes. You can find out more on the FCC auction website. And I will just show you that real quick as well, so that you have some insight into that auction. And there's the site. I will put this out on the chat so you can go to it as well and learn a little bit more about it. But you can tell here that it begins on July 23rd. If you go to the fact sheet, you'll get all the information about it. And when it begins on July 23rd, there's where I pulled that diagram from. You can see all the facts that it's county-based. All of that stuff is here in the fact sheet. And then once the auction begins, we'll see more activity around that website there. All right, thank you, Bev. Wetterhorn Wireless is Dish. Thank you for that correction. I forget what name Comcast is using, but they are using another name as well. So thanks for the correction, Bev. I appreciate that. All right, good stuff. Let me wind down here in the last 10 minutes. Please continue to ask your questions. Thank you for the active participation in the chat window. I love it. If we put all this together, a couple of key points. What is CBRS? It is a 150 megahertz spectrum band, defined to be TDD, time division duplex. We've talked about the range, 3.55 gigahertz to 3.7. Well, I can use it for indoor or outdoor. Devices are available and networks have been deployed that are using GAA already. I showed you that example of the pop-up clinic that Federated had done. We talked about the 3-tier strategy. GAA, full commercial deployment happened in January of this year. You're free to begin to deploy networks using GAA licenses now. And many people have, and many people are looking at that and doing that in the near future. PAL licenses, that auction begins later this month, and you get not exclusive use to that license, but priority use to that license. And unlike other licenses, you get a block, not a specific block, but you are guaranteed to be able to use that block when you need it above the other GAA users, but not above the tier 1 incumbents. And it's unique because it is a 3-tiered shared spectrum approach. Again, the FCC defined this, so it is a band that is only used here in the US at the moment. That band, that same spectrum band, is being used in Europe, but not in the same shared fashion. So let's innovate. The opportunity here is tremendous. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you and your companies are going to innovate here in an amazing way. Manish, is there a limit to the number of blocks a bidder can bid for in PAL? Yes, there is, Manish, 4. So one bidder can get 4 blocks per PAL or per county. So that is the limit. Arvind mentioned that all tier 1 providers need more bandwidth. That's exactly right. That's why they want CBRS. I heard someone say, I never see spectrum that I don't like. All spectrum has its pros and cons, but think about it. Think about this number right here, 150 megahertz. That's more spectrum than some large operators have in the low and mid-band spectrum, more than they already own. So this is pretty significant. Now, it's not as much as the recent millimeter wave auctions. Those are in another stratosphere as far as size of spectrum, right? There we were talking about hundreds of megahertz, nearing 1,000 megahertz of spectrum. That's incredible. But compared to traditional low and mid-band spectrum allocations across the US today, this 150 megahertz chunk is significant and will make a dent. All right, Manish, I hope that answered your question. Dipankar, I hope that answered your question as well. Please jump in with any other questions as we wrap up. By the way, I've got to tell you, Arvind will be leading a CBRS Tech Primer in just 2 weeks. So I really want to encourage you, if you have more detailed questions, that's something that you can take advantage of, and you can sign up for that. I'll send you the link right now where you can sign up for that. Oh, it looks like Bev already beat me to it. Awesome. Thank you, Bev. And so please do that. You can see all of our courses that are coming up in July. I just went ahead and showed you all of them. But here is the tech overview of CBRS July 29th. Lastly, you can use this coupon called webinar at checkout for any of our tech primers and self-paced e-learning courses and get 20% off. So I encourage you to leverage that as you check out those courses. Our tech primers are great. They're 4 hours long. They get into more detail, so you get a little more opportunity to dive into some of these things. And we have a lot of good self-paced e-learning courses available to you as well. So folks, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys being involved in this session today. I would love to connect with you in LinkedIn. Please use your camera, use that QR code, look me up, Mark Harms, and you'll find me pretty easily on LinkedIn, I hope. And you can email me as well at m4markharms@awardsolutions.com, or you can even give me a phone call. I'd love to help you out if you have additional questions around any of these topics on CBRS. Antoine, we will be sending the slides, don't worry, and you'll get a link to this recording. So you will have both access to the slides and the recording. So you'll be receiving those from Award in the next few coming days. All right, can a bidder prefer CBRS over C-Band? Okay, Nabil, good question. Nabil, I think, well, the easy answer is I don't know. It's going to depend on the bidder and where they are. But what we'll see, I believe, is some bidders lose out on PAL licenses because it gets too expensive and maybe go to C-Band. I think other operators who need more mid-band may go big in both the PAL and the C-Band auction. The C-Band, by the way, for those of you that don't know, is slightly higher than the CBRS band. It's in that 3.7 to 4.2 range. And that auction has already been announced for December of this year. It's possible that it'll get pushed a little due to COVID and some other things, but well, having these two mid-band auctions back to back is interesting. So the two could either create more awareness and increase, or create some competition as far as my budget dollars go, right? As someone who's wanting to buy the spectrum. So we'll see how that happens. I hope that answered your question, Nabil. You could argue that there's a slight advantage of CBRS since it's slightly lower and the propagation is better, but that advantage I think is minimal. I think it'll come down more to cost than anything else. All right, Prakash, I'm so glad that you enjoyed the session. Antoine, great. I still have 5 minutes here, so if you have questions, please jump in the chat and ask me any questions. If you have any feedback, put it in the chat and say, Mark, this was great. It covered the right amount of detail in 1 hour. Or Mark, hey, I wish you would have gotten into this topic. Put it in the chat. If there's something that we can help you with in the future, put it in the chat as well. I love feedback. I love to engage with you, and I'm looking forward to it. Andy, great slides. Thank you. Manish, you're welcome. Thank you so much. I do have to have a shout out for Arvind. Arvind, I really appreciate all you did in answering the questions in the chat. That was fantastic. Nick, glad that you enjoyed it. Mary Beth, thank you. I'm glad that Award Solutions always provides a fantastic training. We sure do try to make that happen. Nabil, Shalon, awesome, thanks. If you have any questions, I'm going to sit here for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. So please feel free to ask those. Amir, again, very well done. Thank you. Good basic understanding of CBRS. Awesome. Thanks for that feedback, Amir. I appreciate it. Vinay, thank you. All right, Dipankar, great session. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Good. Thank you, Dipankar. John, I'm glad it was very informative. I hope it exceeded your expectations. So thank you for participating. Benaya, thank you as well. I appreciate it. Swaminathan, great info on CBRS. Awesome. I'm glad it was to the point. I like to get to the point, cut to the chase, but also help simplify it and not overwhelm you with acronyms, which is hard to do on this topic with all these fun ESCs, SASs, and CBSDs and what have you. Can you provide some insight on power limits on CBSD A and B? Absolutely, Manish. Let me just show you that slide one more time, Manish. Let me get the number so I can just go directly to that slide. Here we go. So Manish, there are the numbers. The EIRP is the effective isotropic radiated power, and the PSD is the power spectral density. And so those two numbers dictate the power. And so a category A device would be are the max power that it can output. And a category B device, as you can tell, can do a whole lot more. When you talk about dBMs here and dBs, every 3 is doubling. So this is a significantly higher output than these. Don't get fooled by this 30 to 47. It's a lot more power. So that's an important piece. And like I said, there's some discussion around category C devices. I forget which company it was. Maybe AT&T has recently publicly lobbied the FCC to add a category C device so that they can use it more effectively to offload their existing cellular networks. Manish, yes, says AT&T. Awesome. All right, I hope that answered your question, Manish, and is helpful. Again, this is not there yet, but I do anticipate that we'll see that in the near future, the category C. All right, good. Thanks for that question, Manish. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad it answered. Awesome. Golam, you're welcome. My pleasure. Garash, thank you. You're welcome. Yes, it will be available offline later. You will get a link that will include the slides and a recording, a link to the recording. So I look forward to you guys being able to get to it later and access that. Again, don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn, email, text, call, whatever. And if you are going to come in 2 weeks, which I hope you are, come to the CBRS Tech Primer in 2 weeks, please do that. And you can see that it's a 4-hour session for $295, but don't forget, use coupon webinar at checkout and you will get 20% off that. So super. Thanks, Arvin, again. I really appreciate all your help. And Beverly just sent you guys the link to the Tech Primer overview for CBRS in the chat. Please jump on that. Amir, Mark, you had said that we get access to Spectrum for a few seconds at a time. That's correct. Is there a standard window when you get it back, assuming the CBSD and devices have managed that? Good question, Amir. I'm not clear on that. I do know that the parameters on there are, I think it's up to 240 seconds, by the way. So what I would anticipate happening is, let's say I get access to block 3 for 30 seconds, and then I ask for another block. The SAS may not give me block 3 because the Navy is using it, because someone else is using it, again, depending on my priority level. And if I'm a PAL user, maybe the SAS would say, hey, another PAL user had already asked for it. Now that you're done, I've assigned it to them. But there's this other block that I'm going to assign to you. So then I get block 5 for the next 30 seconds. So I think that's how the back and forth will go, Amir. And so I hope that that makes sense and gives you some insight into how I believe that will work. But yes, the SAS will can suspend and then reenact you so that you can use it again, or terminate you altogether. I hope that answered your question, Amir. All right, I see that it's 12:01, and it looks like many people have dropped off, and I don't see any new questions. Good, Amir, I'm glad that answered your question. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here, and then I will sign off here. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have other questions.